Gojko Halstead, and although I'm not wearing a blue polo, I too work for Excella. We have some centers of excellence within the company, and I actually lead up the Business Analysis Center of Excellence. So I typically give this talk to a more functional audience, but that's why I have Richie with me, because he's going to help me make sure that we keep it developer focused and have that developer perspective. So the topic is lead by example, and it's how to ensure that your teams build the right solutions. So the way that I want to get the conversation started this afternoon is I want you all, in case you haven't met your neighbor yet, I want you to self-organize and spend the next 5 minutes talking about these two items. So how do you know that you have delivered the right solutions? And then what are some of the challenges and limitations of that approach? So spend 5 minutes, self-organize, either pair up or get together in groups of 3s, talk for a few minutes, and then at the end of the 5 minutes, I just want a few volunteers that can share what you've learned from your experience in building software solutions. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is not just think about the simple and obvious answer, and it's that your QA team has gone through their series of test cases and they've passed it, or your users have gone through their series of user acceptance test cases and they've passed it and they said it's good to go to production. So think about what is it that they're really doing to interrogate the system and ensure that it's the right thing that the business wants. Okay, so we're going to do that, and we're going to spend 5 minutes starting now. We're at our 5 minutes, so I want to see if I can get 1 or 2 volunteers. Just stand up and report out what you discussed amongst your group. We already have a volunteer. Thank you.
Good enough. All right. Well, one of the things we talked about was traditionally you have like requirements, documents, right? Those things would be doing demos for a client. In a more agile sense, talk about things like early collaboration and feedback with the product owner, right? And from a software development point of view, having a good solid definition of done, so that your own team has a sense of what is correct or good. Some limitations of those approaches: requirements documents, obviously often dead before arrival and outdated very quickly. Don't give you any feedback, etc. Demos. The customer's not driving, so maybe they won't get some of the stuff they need, and so on.
So it's until they're actually in the system using it day to day that they might find that it's not exactly what they want. But I think that's an excellent point about the requirements document. You said it's dead on arrival. So that's actually what I want to talk a little bit more about today, is making that a living, breathing specification. So any other volunteers? I think you had a really good list. Okay?
So we had delivering, the client sees what you're delivering. The analysts are testing your inputs and outputs, making sure that the product is doing what it's supposed to do. It's meeting client expectations. And client satisfaction, which leads to continued work, is one way of knowing that you've delivered the right solution. Another way of telling whether you delivered the right solution is you had some revenue goal for what it's going to meet. You either meet that revenue goal or you go broke.
Right. So one of the points you made is that the analyst tests the inputs and the outputs. And where do you get those?
I don't know.
I can add it.
Hopefully from the requirements, right?
So it's like it's about the initial requirements and analysis, because we deal with geospatial data sets. The requirements and things are like pretty dynamic in nature, and it's complex. It's not as if like you get this as y equal mx plus c, and it's kind of various spatial analysis, and that's been done on the fly, and as a result you can't really predict what is the expected output. But the analysts do the same process manually, like in spatial analysis and overlays, and get you an expected output. That's where they compare it against the input and output.
Okay, great, thank you very much.
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I've hijacked the presentation.
Okay.
Okay, now you're ready.
All right. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. I think it's always helpful when you come into these presentations and somebody's going to talk to you about a specific technique like I am today. I'm going to be talking to you about the specification by example technique. It's helpful, I think, to share the background and how I got exposed to this particular technique. And so I'll let you know, for the past 4 years I've been working out at the Office of Personnel Management. I've been working in their retirement program. And when we started this project, it was a really small team of developers and analysts. And we were following an Agile approach, and we were building all this great software. We had nobody to test it. And at the time, the gentleman that spoke earlier this morning, Mike Lagar in the back, was on our team. And one of the things that he told me that he was a really lazy programmer. And so what I learned after working with him is that number one, he was right. And that number two, anything that there was potential for automation, there's that. So something that was routine, core functionality, we want to try to automate that as much as possible. So we collaborated together because the analysts we were the ones, we were interfacing with the business stakeholders on a weekly basis. And we were having these long, drawn-out requirements conversations, and we wanted to be able to convey that information to the developers in a way that was very concrete and concise. Because what we developed over those weekly, monthly, and yearly requirement sessions is that we gained all this tacit knowledge, and it wasn't necessarily very easy to convey because we knew a lot of the background. We had the business domain. So how could we do that in a way that would make it easier for them to understand exactly what the business wanted and could develop that software easily? So we started following the specification by example approach. And so before I lead into, I'm going to just basically break down the approach by showing you an example. One thing that would be helpful for me to understand is just by show of hands, how many of you have already been exposed or heard of the spec by example technique? Okay, so maybe 10, 15% of you. Great. So what I want to do is I'm going to take what I learned. I basically distilled the content from this book, Spec by Example. It's something a lot of us have read by Gojko Adzic, and distilled it into a 6-step process, and I'll do that by going through an example. But before we do that, I have 2 exercises. And here's how I want it to work. I'm going to explain the rules, and Stephen is going to help me with this. So I've got 2 exercises, and we're going to do it as a group. I'm going to bring up a slide, and it's a timing exercise. So think of it as a list of requirements. And what I'm going to ask you to do is read the requirements, and then when you've figured out what the requirements are asking or what they're conveying, telling you, just raise your hand. So we're going to see how long it takes to get to the first answer, and then we're going to kind of wait for the entire group, see how long it takes the entire group to get it. And we have a couple of toys, some prizes. So to whoever gets it right for the first exercise, and the same for the second. Does that make sense? Did everyone understand? Okay. All right, so we're going to have Stephen do the timing. Starting now. Who's first?
Put his hand up pretty quick back there. Is this smiley face?
Is there somebody still trying to figure it out?
Or do you all have?
Raise your hand.
Don't raise your hand, just say, need more time. Anybody need more time? The game doesn't end till somebody who needed more time says, I don't need any more time. Is there anybody still trying to figure it out?
Got it? Okay. So I handed out a card to the gentleman who rose his hand, we think, first. Just let us know what you think.
Smiley face.
That's right. And how long did it take?
It took about 15 seconds for the first person.
15 seconds. And how about for the last?
A little over a minute.
A minute. Okay. So how easily would you have been able to identify that by just seeing that picture? Which, let's just say in software development world, that's a screen monitor. lot easier, right? So that's really kind of what we wanted to demonstrate. It's not that you can't understand requirements that are text-based, but it's just so much easier with an example or a mock-up. We're going to do the same exercise for the same drill for the next exercise. The difference is that this is kind of the world that we live in right now at our client site. It's very it's business rule based, and so it takes a little bit of domain knowledge to understand. So we're going to bring up exercise 2, same timing exercise. And for the gentleman that got it first, do you want to pick a price?
Sure.
So we have
a baseball, a football, a moody face, or some pop rocks. I don't know what a moody face is, but it looks like a squishy.
I'll take the pop rocks.
So there's
Careful
some-
with those, no liability.
All right, ready?
Ready to start?
All right, here's the next example. What we are looking for is we're looking for an equation. And I just identified the 2 variables for you, so we're talking in the same language, our x and our y.
Okay, starting now.
Hey, Steve.
When you raise your hand, if you're, just say something so I know to look up from the stopwatch.
So I work with Shava in the back. He should get this right away.
It might help if you actually wrote it down too, so after you get it.
We have So what about this? What if I did this and showed you an example? Maybe that would make it a little easier.
It's an equation. It's not a smiley face. If you think you can write it down and raise your hand. Don't let somebody else get the football, baseball, or mushy face. Was that what it was?
Moody face. Do
Moody
something
face.
better. Okay.
Does everybody have it? I got one hand here. Are you raising your hand? You got it? I think that gentleman in the back raised his hand first, but I thought he was stretching.
Okay, we're gonna stop it. All right.
So that was about 1 minute and 15 seconds.
So what equation did you end up with after seeing the example?
It's x over y times,
Not quite. Someone else.
X times y divided by 62. Should be an answer.
Not quite either. But you're closer.
Okay, this gentleman here.
X y by 40.
That's right.
Y 40.
That's right.
That's it.
So it's the estimated benefit, which is X, times the actual years of service, which is Y, over 40.
It's the same thing. That's what I said.
What is
It's the same thing. X times y divided by 62.
I thought you said 62.
62,
What was
40.
Yeah, I'm wrong.
It's okay. Thank you for trying. What did you want? No.
It's okay.
You've got the mini moody face or the baseball or football. Who wins? Okay.
I don't even know what it is.
Okay, so thank you for walking through those exercises. The point again was just to demonstrate it's not that you can't understand the requirements. It's just that it's a lot easier if you have an example. And you know, if you are today collaborating with your business analysts and your QAs, one of the things that I found in my experience is that whenever we were dealing with a particularly complicated feature or enhancement to a system, what we would end up doing is we would be crowding around a whiteboard and we would be fleshing out all the different scenarios with real data, with real examples. And so that's essentially what this technique does. So I mentioned that in looking at this book, I distilled it into 6 different steps. And I have them up here. It's basically starting with a feature from the product backlog and evolving it through to examples through these steps. So feature gets selected in your sprint planning session. You develop the user story. You assign it to a sprint. You collaborate. You develop the scenarios. You define the acceptance criteria, and then you develop all the different examples to verify that you understand what that requirement, what that specification is. One of the things I just want to caveat is that it's an Agile engineering conference, so I have some basic Scrum terminology in the presentation. If there's anything that you don't understand, just let me know. All right, so here's the example. I'm going to walk through this example to sort of demonstrate how you could make this very real at your client side or within your company in working with your analysts. So we have this system that we want to build, and it's for our pets. So our pets can get microchipped, and then what we're going to do is there's these different microchip providers, so we want to store all of that information in the same repository, so that if anybody ever loses their pet, they have a way of being able to go online and search for them. So on the left-hand side, we've got our product backlog. So we have our list of features that we eventually want in this system, and then when you get to your sprint planning, you pick an item from the backlog that you are going to prioritize and assign to that sprint. So it's the very last one, allowing your registered users to search for missing pets. So that's step one. Step two is defining the user story. So written in a common template for an Agile, as a registered pet user, I want to search online so that I can know that my lost pet has been found. Everyone's familiar with that template. And then you get to the collaboration portion of the process, and that's where, as I mentioned, as an analyst, you're the ones dealing with the business stakeholders, so you have a really firm understanding of what it is they want. And so now is your opportunity to meet with other members of the team to get other perspectives to weigh in. So you want to involve your QA, and you want to involve your developers. And sometimes this is called the Three Amigos meeting. You can call it whatever you want, but it's really your chance to make sure that you understand the boundaries of that feature. And one of the things that we recommend is that you want to make sure everybody has an equal opportunity to get prepared. So do whatever it takes to get, so if the analyst is the one meeting with the business stakeholders, you want to make sure that you are providing the right level of information to your QA and developers ahead of time so that they have time to prepare and think of, well, what are some edge cases or boundary conditions that the analyst may not have thought about. So otherwise, whoever is the expert can sometimes dominate that conversation. So that's all that you want to do with that, is make sure that everyone's equally prepared. And it helps build a shared understanding of what that feature is going to entail. So here's what we end up with after some collaboration with the analyst, the QA, the developer. So we want to spend this time confirming and clarifying. So we want to only allow registered users to be able to log into this system. And we're going to say that the microchip ID, although there are different vendors and providers, that's unique. That's going to be our unique key in the database. And we want to allow our registered users to be able to search on a couple of different search parameters. And so we're going to start with the microchip ID, that's unique, phone number, and email address. Those are two pieces of contact information that we can reliably expect to be in our repository. And then finally, we don't want to allow wildcard searches, only exact matches, because we don't want them to be able to search on other people's pets. So that's what we get out of that collaboration step of the process. The next step is figuring out what your scenarios are. And one of the reasons why you want to do that is because the benefit is that it helps you figure out if you have right-sized that user story. So if you end up with something like 10 to 15 scenarios, you may realize that that is too much to tackle for the sprint. And you may need to have to prioritize, well, let's just focus on these 3 to 4 scenarios for this sprint. We'll get to the others later. And think of them as the outline. So it's the outline for that user story. And like I mentioned, it helps you determine if it's right size and encourages conversation amongst the team. So here's what we have for this user story. We end up with 2 scenarios. So we're going to have a search with results and a search search without results. We have 2, so we're pretty confident that this is right size for the sprint. Any questions so far?
So let me interject some commentary here so I don't feel like I'm just standing up here. As Rebecca is putting this together, the real question is why are we talking about business analysis at an Agile engineering conference? And I think the big key thing here is if you were running a t-shirt printing company, which would you rather get, the written requirements or the smiley face design? As an engineer, you really need to know what it is your business analyst has to bring you. You're building a deterministic system. It has to obey the laws of physics. It has to do the same thing over and over again. Right? Having somebody come and say, I want to spin wool into gold is only going to frustrate you. I don't care how well those requirements are written, you can't do it, you can't do it. It's one of the reasons why Scotty is always talking about not breaking the laws of physics. And as engineers, we have to stay in reality. And so what Rebecca is showing you here, from the engineering perspective, is where do you get to that really helps? Scenarios. How do you get your requirements in a structured format that makes sure that all key things are considered? And then what we're going to try and do is take it to the next level. So this is really looking at it from an Agile engineering, say, you want to get the love you need, okay? You want to get the information and requirements you need in the way you need them. Examples make a big difference. Visuals make a big difference. But more importantly, all these scenarios make a big difference. So hopefully you're getting that vision from the engineering perspective.
And one thing that I will show you is when you get to the point where you're building your acceptance criteria, this technique and this structured format, it lends itself nicely to automation. You don't have to automate, but if that is something that you and your team decide makes sense, it really does allow you to build a good suite of regression tests. So now that we have our scenarios, we're going to build the acceptance criteria for both of those scenarios. So the first scenario, we've got our search with results. And one thing I want to point out, on the next slide I'll explain the structured template. It's a given, when, then. So the given is it's your precondition. So all of these conditions must be met in order to have this acceptance criteria. And then you have your when, and so that's when some action occurs. It's a triggering action. And then you've got your then. So when you have that precondition and that action occurs, then this is the expected result. And one of the rules of thumb is that, like Mike and Sam were speaking earlier, you want to have one action. So you want to have just one event, because if you have multiple events, you're not really sure what caused that expected output, or maybe an output that deviates from the expected output. So in this case, we've got a registered pet owner. That's part of the precondition. And their lost pet is in the database. And their lost pet is flagged as found. So that means that somebody has scanned that microchip somewhere, veterinary clinic, shelter. When that pet owner searches by search parameter. So I just want to point out that a way to make your acceptance criteria more dynamic is that you can parameterize some of your elements, because as we mentioned when we did the collaboration, there's not just one way that you can search by 3 different parameters, and that makes it a little bit easier to define your table of example data. We'll get to that in a minute. So when all those conditions are met, then the search results are returned from the interface. Does that make sense?
So the Gojko, are we able to use or?
Yes.
Using a Gojko language.
Yes,
Are
we
you
can.
able to use or?
We can.
So it's given and when then. I'm not sure about or.
You can do
Okay.
or, and there's actually an or in our second scenario. I'll explain that in a minute. So the second scenario is search without results. So given a registered pet owner, their lost pet is not in the database, so that can be one part of the precondition. Or their lost pet is in the database, but they're not tagged as found. Or the search parameter is invalid. So whatever they've entered. So you can have ands or ors in your givens and in your thens. mentioned, a rule of thumb is just to have one triggering event.
So either using or we could use kind of like say maybe not in database, so like in database tags, so categorize
You could do that.
in database and in there. Maybe it's more.
You could do that, and that's actually one of the things that Stephen mentioned he could talk a little bit more about in the open space, because one of the things that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time is that there's an analyst component, which is we're going to define these requirements for our developers using this technique in this format, but then I mentioned it lends itself to automation. It's in most cases, not in all cases, because you could have a technical BA that wants to start learning how to instrument some of these acceptance tests. In most cases, on most teams, it's going to be the developers that are instrumenting the tests and making them automated. And you want to do that, you want to pick a technology or tool that makes sense for the development team. One of the things that Stephen can talk more about is domain-specific language, and how do you have the right level of abstraction to make these acceptance tests maintainable. The other thing we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about is the testing pyramid. And so you know that acceptance testing is higher up on that testing pyramid, they're more expensive, they're more timely. So you want to be very efficient about how you define your automated acceptance tests. So if that's a topic you're interested in, I'm volunteering him to talk to you about that after this.
But it raises a very good question, right? Which is, you as an engineer are now having a conversation with an analyst that is really about, well, we have two scenarios here. Maybe we should break scenario 2 into different scenarios. Can we manage that differently? So you're having basically about whether it's a fine grain or a large grain scenario and that type of thing. Those are very constructive conversations. The conversations are about the problem and understanding the problem. Too many times I've seen where the analyst is talking and the developer is not understanding, and they have nothing to collaborate on because it's almost as if they're speaking different languages, right? One is presenting paragraphs of information, and the developer is asking very specific questions about how this works. So I think the key is these structured languages, if you start here, give you the ability to have those discussions. How can we break this up? Can we look at that as one scenario or a different scenario? How do we OR these together, whether they should be ORed together, that type of thing.
Good point. Okay, so I wanted to show the example first before showing what the template is for the acceptance criteria. But it's pretty much talked through everything. You've got your given, the context or preconditions. When you have a specific event, then you get the expected behavior output. So this is a template that your business analyst can write their requirements in. All right. So then the final step in the process is the real examples. And so I just took our scenario 1. This is our search with results. As I mentioned, you can parameterize the when condition, or actually anything within the acceptance criteria, but we happen to parameterize the action. So what the registered pet owner is searching by, and we've got these 3 different attributes that they can search by. And so what your analyst would do is work with their business stakeholders to get real data or real examples that they see out there in the field, and then populate this table. And this is what can eventually get automated at some point. I picked a quote from the book because it kind of resonated with me in that using examples, we do it in everyday conversations, everyday life. It's a very tangible, concrete way to make things clear. So I think this is a great technique for doing that. I want to show, so I included a couple of tools that you can use for doing automation. This is where maybe I think the developers would be more interested. And then there's also a resource at the bottom where you can go to see what else is out there. Quickly, I'm going to show you 2 examples from our project, and then I'm going to hand it over to Stephen. He's got a working example in SpecFlow.
Cucumber.
Cucumber, okay.
So if you go back 1 slide, I'll show you a example using Cucumber.
Okay. So this is a business rule that we automated on our project, and one of the nice things about it, we used Concordian. But one of the things you can see is here's our expected output. That's the then condition. we say whether it should pass or it should fail. And we've got a great user interface that will tell us if something has passed or has failed. So for example, if we said that this condition should have failed and it really passed, we would see that that is red. So we have, on a very regular basis, we know whether some recent change to the software has caused functional regression.
When you say you automated that, what do you mean? Or is that something he's going to demonstrate later?
I am going to demonstrate how you automate these. Yeah, I will, exactly.
Is there another question?
Regarding documentation, so the acceptance criteria, how you document that stuff? Is it you, like in the particular ticket, Jira ticket or some other place that, like in the story?
You can. You can do that. We have a couple different ways
Okay,
of
so I
doing
just want
our
to hear
project.
from you the example.
So an example, we use Jira on a project, and many of you may face compliance issues where, although you're doing Agile, you still need to produce a list of requirements. So on a monthly basis, what we do is we have our categories in Jira. We'll export the requirements, the user stories, the acceptance criteria for a particular category because it relates to a project, and we'll export that and put it on the shared drive and share it with our stakeholders. In other cases, we have to develop guidance that isn't just internal for developing our programs, but it's for other agencies to develop their programs. So in that case, we have to build something a little bit more robust and more waterfallish. So a lot of documentation. It does depend though. Depends on sort of the requirements that you have for your requirements on your project. If that makes sense.
So let me ask this question. When a developer finds a bug that they created, what is the first thing they do? What? What?
Blame someone else.
They're going to either write a unit test or they're going to fix it, right?
I like the first one.
Right? They're not going to go to Jira and write the steps to reproduce the issue that they just created, right? They're not going to hand that off to the project manager that says, please track this bug I just created, right? And they're not going to ask somebody to verify that they fixed it themselves. So one of the key things that Rebecca is illustrating here is that if you have the acceptance tests in the developer's hands and they make a change that causes the acceptance tests to fail, they don't write up the bug in Jira. They don't track the bug in Jira. They don't go to meetings to discuss why they introduced the bug and why the bug, where it is and how it should be prioritized. They just go fix it, right? So really a lot of getting the requirements in these structured formats is about avoiding that process down the line of adding those things. Because if somebody independently verifies and validates that they introduced a bug, then it really does need to get tracked. But if they're on their own development environment, they make a change and it causes a requirement to fail over here, they realize that the change they made was probably not thorough enough, it wasn't as involved. So they expand it and they correct it and then do the like. Right? So some of what we're trying to do is actually avoid that issue of how do we record these problems and where do we take them? Because if a defect falls in the developer's lap, then the defect isn't really a defect at all if they've created it themselves.
Okay, well this was another example. So I think that what I'd like to do now is turn it over to you to show the demo in Cucumber.
Okay. How much time do we have?
So Fadi said we could go as long as we wanted.
As long as we want
I
it.
said that to you, Rebecca, not to Steve.
That's a tremendous amount of power.
We have about 10 minutes left, right?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay. Now you can see my desktop. Let me give you the example that Rebecca did. And I'm going to start with the gherkin. Okay, can everybody read that? Okay. This is called a feature file. And it's written in a language known as Gherkin. and Cucumber executes the gherkin. Now, many people find that these kitschy little names are problematic. There's another tool called SpecFlow, which does essentially the same thing. And I've actually read where somebody said that people were really reluctant to use Cucumber because of the name, and that they found SpecFlow was a little bit. So I don't even like to call this Cucumber anymore. I like to call it an automated integration test. Roberta has a statement, a question.
You do know that gherkin is a type of teapot.
I do. I actually know that. Yes. So the metaphor is even lost there. You know, the language of gherkin is used for the tool of Cucumber. It didn't make sense to me. Right?
If you use AI, that becomes AIG, which isn't exactly a great name either.
Yeah. So what I want to do is show you that what Rebecca produced is now in a structured text file. Rebecca could maintain this file. And I've taken out some of the parameterization and some of the detail just sort of simplify it. But there are two scenarios that are written up here. Search without results. And I just have two values in here. This value and this value. And I just happen to know that my integration database has one of those values and doesn't have another value. So I'm not particularly worried. So let's go ahead and run this scenario. I'm going to have to bring up the magnifier here. Let you see this. So running at this port right here, I have an application. And we don't have to get into the details too much, but it's a service that's going to it's called PetaChip, right? And what it is a microchip thing. You give it a microchip, and you say, have you found this? So as developers, we're trying to create this service, right, that supports that. And so based on the documentation we received from Rebecca, we've gone in and we started building this thing. And we even have a little document here. And this is a developer's document. Can everybody see that okay? But basically we have a method in our little web service, and you pass it in a credential ticket or session ticket. And then you go down the line here and you pass it in a microchip ID, and you say, is the status found? And so if that ID is in a found status, it will return you a response. And that response will include the pet's ID and the pet's name and other pieces of information. If, on the other hand, you call that API with the microchip ID and you ask status is found, it could come back and say, pet not found, right? So you have a sort of little API that you built, right? As a developer, it's running now. Well, what I have is I have a Cucumber test that's going to run. And what it's going to do is it's going to take that file, that gherkin file you saw, the feature file, and it's going to execute all of the steps within that in the proper order. So it's going to make sure the given condition is there, and then it's going to follow through and take the action in the when statement, and then make sure that everything works correctly in the then section. And so when we run this test, what Cucumber is going to do is it's going to show each of the different steps. It has my two scenarios, and it's going to process each of those steps as it goes through. Okay, I'm going to kind of lead you backwards into how this all works. So we'll just keep going backwards. So let's take a look at our gherkin again. And the example I will change right now, 297.98. Okay? And that's the correct format. Okay? So now my code isn't changing. My service is still running, right? and I'm going to run my cucumber tests again. Now I've changed the requirement, and it starts blowing up. You say, well, that's not very human readable, Stephen. What it's actually going to do is it's going to give me a little bit of more in my acceptance test. Out in the build folder, there is an HTML file that I'm going to open up in Chrome. Okay? So this will actually show me how each one passes and fails, depending on my test. Let me zoom that in a little bit. So that's just a little HTML that has a style sheet associated with it. And guess what? TeamCity can display this. It can read this type of thing, right? And there's a little XML behind that as well, if you want to actually evaluate it. So these two scenarios are actually, for those that are red, green, blind, I really apologize because it's difficult to see that this line is red and everything else is green. And that's because the search results are returned as failed. This step, when I change the ID in the requirement, fails because my integration database doesn't have a microchip by that ID anymore. Right? It had the ID that I had before, didn't have this ID. Okay? So, you're sitting here wondering, how does all of that work? Well, let me bring up Eclipse, and I'm going to try and zoom this a little bit more. And behind that, let me get the magnifier out. Okay, let's get to the top of it. What happens is Cucumber has a facility to look at the feature file and say, are there any steps defined for that feature? And if the answer is no, it'll spit out something that'll say, you need to define these things for me, right? And what they are is pieces of code. This is a piece of Groovy code right here. And what it's going to do, and for those of you who are in the Java world, you've probably heard of Groovy, some of you may be using Groovy, but it's going to let me establish what that logic is to support each one of these tests. And just to give you a hint here, what's happening is it's keying off of the text. A registered pet owner in that file, given a registered pet owner, is now tied to this piece of code. So whenever Rebecca says, given a registered pet owner, it's going to run this code. That's a given condition. It's part of the arrangement, okay? Given their lost database in the thing. This is where I'm going wrong, right? I need to add a 1297.98, right? So if I were to add that, really add that, right, and change the logic so that my web service could now retrieve that record, then this test would pass. Well, I've kind of made my test a little bit hokey here, for lack of a better word. And so what it's actually going to do is it's going to actually not do it'll call the web service, but it's not going to actually analyze it the same way. So I've got to kind of go change the way this behaves and change this to a 1297. So I'm going to go into my logic here, save everything, leave my magnifier behind here. So, drum roll, please. We are going to test our luck here and run Cucumber again. And it passes. Now, with our change in requirement.
Hey, Stephen.
Yes?
What happens if Rebecca changes like a word or two within that string in the specification itself? Would your code not pick it up then?
So that would basically start changing what it's looking for, right? If it says, given a pet custodian not in the database, right? Well, custodian is not the same thing as an owner, so that would be another given condition, right? So what you're doing is you're changing the relationship between the automated piece and the requirement. So you'd have to change the code, and what it would probably
Is it
tell
looking for an exact match?
yes, it's looking for a match. And there are some ways to parameterize it, right? And we can talk in more detail about that. So now if I refresh this page, both of these are passing tests. They're collapsed in my HTML. I can see that they're passed, and I get that information. So as a developer, I can now use this tool to create a suite of automated tests. I can integrate it into TeamCity, and so I can get that kind of information. This particular example is using an automated integration testing technique. So it's talking to that web service each time, sitting over here, every time it gets called. But it doesn't have to be necessarily with that. There are other ways to work it. But the idea is that you are now having an automated specification that gives the developer feedback as to whether requirements are changing and therefore code is not meeting those requirements anymore. Or if you're making a change as an engineer, it may be breaking existing requirements. It'll give you that feedback as well. And putting it all into the continuous integration requirement.
Right, and so one of the things that Stephen showed was that web page that showed you your requirements and whether it passed or failed. So at the very beginning of the presentation, somebody mentioned that requirements go stale very quickly, and this is a way to have living specifications. And you know, if like Stephen said, the developer goes in, makes a change, and it broke something that used to work, and it failed an existing requirement. So you now have a living, breathing specification. I think that's it for us. We just wanted to show contact information. So Stephen and I will both be outside in the open space for the next couple of minutes if you have any questions. And I think lunch is here.